This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
A nice 8th century German girl somehow got wrapped up in a day that is devoted to the occult. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert as we're recording this toward the end of what is called Walpurgisnacht. Joining me is our expert on this field. He has done a lot of research into the history of witchcraft and the occult. He is also the director and senior fellow of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology and the author of such books as Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim. He's working on a forthcoming book we're eagerly awaiting to read with another friend of ours, Dr. Aaron Judkins, on the mysterious site Göbekli Tepe, about which we've spoken a couple of times on this program recently. It is our honor to welcome back to the program our friendly neighborhood PhD, Dr. Judd Burton. Judd, thanks for joining us tonight.
Good, thanks.
Walpurgisnacht. Many of us have heard the term, self-included, but know very little about it. All I know is that it's connected to an 8th century German saint in the Roman Catholic Church, Saint Walpurga, who somehow got her name attached to this event, which seems to be generally described for us mundanes as a sort of German Halloween celebration. How accurate is that description? And how did a nice girl like Walpurga get mixed up in all this?
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate description. Saint Walpurga, as you pointed out, was an 8th century saint, and in the what she was revered for was her ministry to the sick and ministering healing and in some cases very specific diseases. She was good at healing, apparently, like rabies, but she was also believed to have been able to not only find but also repel witches. So, on the surface, this seems like the never-ending quest of ancient and medieval European Christianity to people the festival calendar with saints' days. In other words, to take these older pagan festival days, and gloss them over, with a canonization of sorts, a Christianization, and that's definitely what you have here, is the appropriation of sacred time. In other words, because Walpurgisnacht is generally celebrated on April the 30th. Going into May the 1st, and it just so happens that this coincides with the older festival between the European pagan festival that coincides with Beltane, is what the Celts called it, but it of course had its analog in the Germanic world too. It was between the spring equinox and the summer solstice, and it was certainly about fertility, but it was less about crops and more about the herds, the furthering of fertility of herds, the fecundity of the herds, maintaining that, but not without some dark overtones. Amongst the festivals amongst the practices that were associated with the festival, included rites that were designed to placate a number of gods, including a solar deity called Bel, and the lighting of fires. Ritual fires was important to this time period as well, and so we get details about these festivals from ancient sources. A lot of them are actually Greek and Roman. So, Julius Caesar wrote about them in his commentary on the Gallic campaign. The geographer Strabo, Pliny the Elder, noted ancient Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius both, they give us little bits and pieces about, these kinds of rituals. And, one of the things that they would do with the lighting of the two bonfires is run their herds of cattle between the fire to try and ritually purify them, and also keep the evil spirits from stealing their fertility and their milk and all of that sort of thing. And one of the more disturbing aspects of this time frame is that it was because it was so associated with fire. This was likely a time when the Wicker Man sacrifices that the Celts were infamous for actually took place. And again, some of these same ancient sources that I mentioned a moment ago give reference to the Wicker Man. And for people who may not be familiar with that, these are, of course, the building of these huge wicker effigies that were large enough to fit in human sacrifices. And so this is where we begin to see more of those darker overtones in the context of Walpurgisnacht. Interestingly enough, as a side note to this, before I even had a religious studies class or mythology or folklore or anything like that, I heard about Walpurgisnacht from a short story that Bram Stoker wrote as a kind of sketch piece he was doing before he wrote Dracula, and it's called Dracula's Guest.
Huh.
And the individual who is unnamed, who's kind of the protagonist in the story, goes for basically a little carriage ride, a country ride, on Walpurgisnacht, and he wants to go down this road, and the local German peasant that's taking him is trying to get him not to do it because he's telling him, look, there's going to be all kinds of high strangeness going on tonight. You don't want to be out here by yourself. And so Walpurgisnacht is actually the backdrop for the short story that Bram Stoker wrote. And of course, for people who have read Dracula, this is also the exact time frame when Jonathan Harker arrives in Romania to visit Dracula. So it is in the sort of popular narrative, in terms of our literary tradition as well. But that was my first exposure to it, and I thought, well, what is this? Is there anything to it? And of course, as I was exposed to it, in an academic setting and in my own research, you find out very quickly that the high strangeness is not all literary device.
Yeah, it's. I thought that sounded familiar. By the way, the arrival of Jonathan Harker at Dracula's castle has some very interesting, similarities to what you just described. So this goes back then long before Walpurga came on the scene.
Yes.
Apparently just an attempt by the church. And by the way, it's just not the Roman Catholic Church that venerates Walpurga. The Lutheran Church also holds her in high regard, which I guess makes sense. And I should point out that I called her a German girl, but that's because she's from the Kingdom of West Sussex, the West Saxons. She was actually born in Devon in the UK, and then went over to the Kingdom of the Franks. This would be around the time of Charlemagne, I guess. So the rites then that are associated with Walpurgisnacht to this day, what are they, and how have they changed over the years? Well,
in general form, I've pretty much laid them out for you. I mean, the big one is the running of the cattle through the bonfires. But it's interesting, particularly if this is a context for the Wicker Man sacrifices, human sacrifices. Disturbingly, we still live with the legacy of that in the form of the Burning Man festival today, which takes its cue directly from the Wicker Man. And in a kind of, ostensibly it's supposed to be this free-spirited celebration of art and culture, but in actuality it's sort of a celebration of hedonism and the self. Not that there isn't art and culture there, but it's all thematically, it's all representative of that. And the tie, at least in terms of morals and ethics, the tie goes back to the kind of rites that they think would have been practiced at a Beltane festival, or in the Germanic case, Walpurgisnacht. Now today, interestingly enough, talking about modern legacies, Walpurgisnacht in Germany is a kind of Halloween there, in which you have people, they still light these huge bonfires like they did in ancient and medieval times, but they dress up as all manner of dark things. So, on Halloween here, you may see vampires and ghosts running around with their trick-or-treat pumpkins, but you might also see Batman and Superman, the little 3 and 4 feet tall Batman and Superman running around. Sure. These costumes are either overtly demonic, and that you see, there are these recognizable archetypes like the devil and witches and warlocks. Not that I'm reducing those to things that don't exist in reality, but just in terms of their patterns. And then some of the costumes are taken from, the stories about the folk spirits and gods that existed in ancient Germanic lands. So there's definitely these darker overtones that remain with the modern celebration of Walpurgisnacht, just short, again, that we know of, just short of human sacrifice. Now, there certainly may be, and I don't want to enter into the realm of conjecture, but it would not surprise me if there were more clandestine rites associated with Walpurgisnacht. We certainly know that practitioners of Satanism, not so much the Church of Satanism, but the darker sort of Luciferian, the people who actually really believe in Satan, Satanism, do practice these kinds of things on Walpurgisnacht because it's one of their holy days.
So this has become, like Halloween here in the United States, then a major holiday in a number of European nations, Germany, Finland, Estonia, the Czech Republic, places like that. This is held on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Yeah, and you have to, you can't really escape the fact that the anchor for, at least one of the anchors for its survival, was the initial, christening of the day by the church, because this happens with any number of festivals throughout these old pagan festivals that were appropriated by the church. A lot of those practices survived even if people didn't remember why they were practicing them. This happens all the time in the history of Europe, where you have these older survivals. They call them hearth religions. In fact, one of the words in the King James Bible used for pagans is heathen. Well, that's the Old and Middle English taken from heath, which was a variation of the word hearth or fireplace. And the reason being is that there were some of these traditions maintain a form of keeping trinkets, of nature spirits that were actually these older gods that the Celts and Germanic peoples and other peoples of Europe worshipped. And they survived, in this form. And there may have been little household rituals that were associated with them, and people didn't really remember altogether why they were doing them. They just remember that they had been traditions in their family for generation after generation. And there have been some really good work. If people want to dig into this and drill down a little bit deeper, by microhistorians like Carlo Ginzburg and I'm trying to think of the other guy's name. I think his last name is Bruhl. But Guido Ruggiero is another really good one. He wrote a book called Binding Passions, and in it are these examples, these survivals of these pagan practices being mixed with Christian practices. And in one of the essays he writes, he talks about a woman
in the 16th century, I believe. Keeping in mind women didn't have equal access to the legal system at that time, and so she basically was trying to level the playing field with somebody that had wronged her by making an effigy, a wax effigy of this person, which is, of course, imitative magic, and then placing the effigy next to the altar in a church, thinking that it would draw some sort of power in her favor for that. And so you've got the older pagan element, being mixed with the Christian element, and this happens again and again and again. It even shows up in the archaeological record of medieval and early modern Europe,
and goes all the way back to Mesopotamia, which leads to kind of a speculative question here. This is something Sharon and I were talking about today as we were researching something else. The Celts are the ones behind this practice, and we know that the Celts back in biblical times were not located where they were later. When the Romans encountered them in the time of Julius and Octavian, and going on to the time of Hadrian, and so the 1st, 2nd century A.D. By that point, they had pretty well been confined to after they were subdued by Julius in Gaul. Then they were many of them were forced across the Channel and were more or less confined to Britain at that point. But we know, going back further in history, the Galatians, Paul wrote a letter to the Galatians, who were the Gauls in the 1st century, and they were located in Anatolia. We also know the Cimmerians. There's a strong possibility that the Cimmerians, or the Cymru, which is a name for the Brittonic peoples later, the Welsh, actually, and they were also located in Anatolia as far back as the time of Ezekiel, 6th century BC. So what is all of that to ask this question? What are the possibilities? Is it possible that these practices can be traced ultimately back to an area where we're getting into Mesopotamian history, and perhaps back even further into prehistoric times, in that location where you put the origin of that the phoneme, meaning king or ruler, the Rex. In other words, the area between the Caucasus, or in the Caucasus, between the Black Sea and the Caucasus Sea, or the Caspian Sea, rather. Can we go back that far, or is that really really speculative?
I mean, yeah, we can absolutely go back that far, because even modern linguists, are comfortable situating the forebears of the Celts and the Germans and some of the other European tribes. They're more than comfortable, because they can demonstrate linguistically how their migration patterns could be mapped out. So, absolutely. I mean, and again, as you point out, this has implications for prehistory as well, particularly if we're talking about that overlap between the Proto-Indo-European and the Proto-Semitic worlds. That area of the Trans-Caucasus, Eastern Turkey, being where basically the peoples of the earth spread from after the flood. To me, that all lines up, pretty clearly. So it's absolutely, and of course, even by the 1st century AD, when Galatians is written, the Celtic peoples were spread from there all the way into Central and parts of Western Europe. But as you point out, they're steadily pushed, into the British Isles, to where the holdouts would have been places like Scotland and especially Ireland.
Mm-hmm. So what do we know? And again, I'm not saying we need to necessarily derive Walpurgisnacht from ancient Mesopotamia. I'm just curious now. What do we know about witchcraft in ancient Mesopotamia? I mean, I think many of us, myself, included, until very recently, had this idea that, let me put it this way: what we know of witches is what we derive from English or German folklore, not realizing that there are other cultures that have long traditions of witchcraft as well. What do we know about witchcraft from Central Asia and Mesopotamia?
Well, even the practices that we know about line up. I go back again and again to the anthropological definition of witchcraft because it's a standard, because it's true of witchcraft traditions over space and time, essentially. And that's very true of the kinds of, solitary specialists that you found in, like the Witch of Endor in the Old Testament, who is one of these roving, Canaanite priestesses, plying her trade. But the key thing about, in terms of understanding a witch anthropologically, is that this is somebody who's using magic for nefarious ends and working against whatever the cultural norm is. So whatever the accepted cultural ethics are, whatever their good or moral standards are, this person has no problem bending that in order to accomplish their aims. Now, they may subscribe to the same set of religious mechanisms, if you will. They may subscribe to the same kind of mythological ideation, but they use it differently, and they're certainly not above doing that for a price. As you can see in many of the traditions in the ancient Near East, and so they're generally solitary. They don't. Even if they belong to a cabal of practitioners, they're not really part of the mainstream organized religion. So you would have, let's say in the Babylonian period, the Amorite Babylonian period, you would have a structured priesthood that dealt largely with the public sphere of religion, the communal sphere. And then you would have, broken down from that, kind of building a diagram, you would have branches of religion practiced in domestic sphere, out in the field, in smaller places, in smaller groups. And this is where you begin to see these sorts of practitioners fit within the scheme of not just world religions, but ancient Near Eastern religion as well.
So the modern practitioners, you mentioned that the modern practitioners who celebrate Walpurgisnacht are trying to recreate what they think were the rites as they were practiced in ancient times. How successfully did the church in the Middle Ages put down these rites, and how close to the ancient rites are the modern neo-pagans replicating them?
Well, as to the first question, how successful were they in completely putting them down? Only partially successful. I mean, clearly, or we wouldn't have evidence to the contrary. We wouldn't have, historians like Guido Ruggiero and Carlo Ginzburg making their careers out of, digging this stuff up, not only from text, but also from archaeology. And so they were only partially successful. The same thing is true of African religion, under the auspices of slavery in the Americas. You still end up with these syncretistic religions practiced, in private settings by the slaves that end up, in traditions like, Vodun or Santeria or Candomblé or, any of a number of those kinds of traditions. And so it was just a partial success. The early church, the very early church, once Christianity gained toleration first and then, official status in the 4th century, even then, the embers of paganism continued to burn. There's a historian named Frank Trombley who wrote a really excellent work on the survival of paganism in the Eastern Mediterranean, and you still found pockets of it even in the Byzantine Empire, during the 7th and 8th century, and he also wrote about some interesting, unique cases in Syria and Egypt in the 8th and 9th centuries AD. And, of course, this is well after Islam had pushed into these regions and was very puritanical in its approach to stamping out what they considered heresy. And so there were great measures, and in fact the places where these individuals practiced the remnants of this paganism were extremely remote regions of these desert, rugged countries. So, you ask how successful were they? Well, again, only partially, because there was enough of it left that, sort of leading into the second question, that there have been, there's been 150 years of neo-paganism, and that's a general term for Wicca and modern Druidism and solitary practitioners and a whole host of people trying to resurrect ancient paganism in the modern era, and this basically formed the basis for my master's thesis. Was to examine how these practices were being adapted, and then how they functioned within a neo-pagan congregation. I had really two routes that I could go after my bachelor's degree. I could get a classics degree and sort of rehash the Greek and Roman stuff that I'd been doing, or I could go the anthropological route, and I found that more interesting because this was as close as I could get to jumping in a time machine and going back and looking, observing mythology and how it was used, how people lived under it in a worldview kind of a sense. It was as close as I could get, and that to me was more interesting. I had already done so much reading on the subject, through the lens of the classics, basically, in the ancient world, that I wanted to. I wanted to see how much of that was left, and it just occurred to me that neo-paganism was as close, as I could get to doing that, and of course, just as the church's success in completely stamping out ancient paganism was only partially successful, I would say that also neo-paganism's attempt to resurrect all those ancient practices is also partially successful. The subtitle of my thesis was the adaptation and function of myth, and so they have to piece back together. It's sort of like reverse engineering from an incomplete, even the best case scenarios that most historians and archaeologists are working with are still, piecemeal and incomplete, and so they're trying to interpret a lot of that and put together an entire theology, based on that. And so I would say that their success is only partial, but it's when you begin to get into, again, the more Luciferian aspects, the more overtly Luciferian aspects. Not that neo-paganism is certainly not influenced by the devil, but they are not professing or stating overtly that they're followers of Satan. They may not even believe in Satan.
They know not what they do.
They know not what they do, exactly. But that does, to me, that's not only a separate academic question, but it's a separate theological question as well, from the kinds of witches that you find under the umbrella of the sort of the Luciferian taxonomy, if you will, what I call the primal witch, in the chapter I wrote on it, An Interview with the Giant. So
I was going to say the thing that's really fascinating then, and this is something that we kind of forget in the church, is that classical literature, we call classical literature, which is just full of, even the stuff that's not overtly religious, is essentially infused with a religious worldview. They believed,
Sure.
they understood that Zeus and Hera and Apollo and Hermes and Mars or Ares they were all real, and they had to either appease them or solicit their favor in order for things to go well. I've just been doing some reading and study on the Sibylline books, not the Sibylline oracles, which were later texts written by Jews and Christians mainly, but the Sibylline books that were kept in the Temple of Saturn in Rome, or Temple of Jupiter rather, in Rome, consulted by the Senate when a bad augur would appear, a shooting star or whatever, and they'd have to go consult and they'd have a group of originally 2, later 15 men who would then go to the oracle and try to consult and figure out what it was they needed to do in order to appease the gods. We modern Christians are a little surprised, I think, to find out that there were people who took those things that seriously, because, frankly, most of us don't take most of the characters in the Bible that seriously.
Right. Exactly. Well, and I think this speaks a lot to the fact that we've pretty much in our educational systems, both in primary education and secondary education, we've jettisoned the original classical methods where people had some conversancy with the Greco-Roman world, but it was at least in the West since the 5th century. When basically the Irish monks saved Western tradition. From being completely destroyed. That's always been married to, heavy education in the Bible. And so people, as long as that system existed, people had some conversancy in that. And it's not about, being sent to rich prep schools or whatever, that only the wealthy could afford. My grandmother had this, and she went to school in a one-room schoolhouse.
Mm-hmm.
I've told this story before, but she was the one that introduced me to the classics. It was her copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey that I read first, and she could quote the Bible chapter and verse. So there again is that marriage of the learning of classical and Western tradition with the heavy biblical theological education. We don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And again, we're privy to so much new, information and research on this topic, but there doesn't seem to be the hunger to understand it, that there was at one time in our society.
Well, and we've been told that we can't teach the classics because it's a bunch of old, well, I don't want to go down that rabbit trail, but critical race theory is, but it's accurate, but I don't want people to dismiss the rest of the conversation, because it's two guys of Anglo-Saxon descent, lamenting the loss of Indo-European culture, because that's really not what this is about. But
so that would make us racist, right? If we embrace all that,
sure. But that's the thing. Well, we're living in a society now where we either admit that we're racist or we are racist. So, you can't win. It's Kafka-esque is what it is. Oh, it is. Yeah. And it goes, that's more literature that isn't being taught in school today is Kafka. But this whole idea, though, that we're not dealing with literal entities who want to do us harm, as these people dancing around the bonfires in Walpurgisnacht, you wonder how many of those people actually believe what they're doing if they just see it as some sort of cultural thing, as many of us Christians today celebrate Christmas and Easter because it's what we do as Christians. I do it because I'm not Jewish and I'm not Muslim and I'm not Hindu. So this is what I do. These are my traditions. My teeth were set on edge. The first time I ever heard the term faith tradition was when I heard Al Gore use that during a presidential debate back in the day. Faith tradition? What are you talking about tradition? This is not tradition. This is history that we're dealing with here. And you either accept history that the resurrection actually happened, which then changes the whole course of history and better change the course of your life, or it didn't. The fact that you don't accept history doesn't change the fact that it actually happened. This is not tradition. We don't do this because it's what we've always done. That makes as much sense as the old joke about the lady who the young bride whose husband sees her slicing the ends off the roast before she puts it in the pan and puts it in the oven. And he asks, why did you do that? Well, I don't know. It's what my mother always did. Mom, why did you always slice the end? I don't know. I'll have to ask your mother. It's what she always did. So grandma gets caught on the phone. They get her on the phone. Why did you always slice the ends off the roast? Well, it's because when I first married your grandfather, I only had a small pan and I couldn't fit a whole roast in the pan. So I sliced the... Many of us in the Christian church today who call ourselves followers of Jesus Christ do what we do as Christians because it's what we've always done. We don't really understand why we're doing it. We don't compare it to the history and see if it tracks with what the witnesses to the resurrection say this faith is all about. How do we interact with the pagan world when we're not really understanding the nature of this reality into which we've been dropped?
Yeah, it's difficult to, but I mean, the flip side of that is that those folks, are really already primed to kind of have those conversations because they at least already have a supernatural worldview. They're however they're doing it, with whatever tradition they're subscribing to, they're professing that they believe in these entities that exist. Well, we do too. It's just that we have a better perspective on them, and it's backed up by things like history and anthropology and archaeology and text and experience and oral tradition and lots of things.
Eyewitness testimony,
eyewitness testimony. And so, there's a conversation there that doesn't have to be pugilistic.
I think the model there is Paul on the Areopagus, Mars Hill. I see that you Athenians are very religious. And I also see that you've got this statue over here to the unknown god. Let me tell you about him. In fact, that's the model that Karl Teichrob used when he attended Burning Man, set up the camp of the unknown god.
That's fantastic. That's perfect. I mean, and that's so Pauline because that's how he has that conversation. At least I think it was Paul, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Who has that conversation about this unknown God that you're talking about. Let me tell you about him because that's the God that I worship. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, these folks, whether they're neo-pagans or gosh, you should be able to enter into a conversation with a Luciferian too, and have this. I mean, it's a more difficult apologetic, almost duel that you would have to. There's a lot of reliance on the Holy Spirit there, but. There's so many people in the world, who literally believe in these entities, because of the religions that they practice. How have we gotten so far away from thinking about our own faith, in those terms? When it's just staring us in the face, in the very document, the very set of texts that we say are our scriptures that are God inspired.
Right.
How we've turned Jesus into a life coach and church into, morally therapeutic deism it should make us quiver.
Well, if the with shame, actually, and because if the events over the past year where we've been denied access to our brothers and sisters in the faith, this is nothing compared to the tribulation that the early church endured. The first century was horrible. The late 3rd century was really bad, and interestingly, that was. Was startled to learn this as we were researching our book Giants, Gods, and Dragons, that the Diocletian persecution,
the great persecution,
was prompted because his co-emperor Galerius was told told by an oracle, I can't we can't get the messages through because the righteous men, the Christians, are blocking the signal essentially. Yep. Which we hear echoed today, in fact, by the teachings of some New Agers who are convinced that we Christians are holding back humanity from evolving into humanity 2.0, into ascending into a higher life form. But it is curious.
Galerius was worse than Diocletian. I mean, Diocletian by that point was just a puppet in a lot of ways. And
it's interesting, though, Galerius, well, it's tragic because unless he had a deathbed conversion, I mean, at the end he relented and even asked some Christians to come in and pray for him because he was possibly suffering the same sort of fate that was at Herod Agrippa, who was eaten up by worms. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a really painful way to go. But it was. You could, when you step back and you look at the long arc of history, you can see the hand of the enemy, and a capital E enemy, principalities and powers, at work even in that, because when he relented and then just a few years later Constantine came on the scene, legalized Christianity, and suddenly becoming a friend of the emperor as a Christian bishop became a career choice instead of a calling. And then there were Christians who remembered with anger how they'd been treated during the last years of the lives of Galerius and Diocletian. Then it was time for payback, and that drove a bigger wedge between the Christians who should have been reaching out in love to their pagan neighbors than would have been the case otherwise, I think.
And how crazy must it have been for the bishops that were invited to Nicaea to get that invitation. It's probably why, at least one reason why all of them didn't attend, because they had seen their flock friends and people like that killed, not even a generation earlier. Right.
Yeah, it's like, no, this is probably a trap. Let's not do that. Friend of ours who has since gone home to be with the Lord, David Duncan, we interviewed in the early days of PID radio back in 05 and 06, came out of a very occult background. He was under the tutelage of a fellow named Alan Noonan, who one night in Haight-Ashbury, 1967, the Summer of Love, Dave said, in a very late night session where they're sitting around drinking or whatever, and he said was transformed into what appeared to be a being of light, and said, "I am Lucifer." That will open your eyes in a hurry. Dave eventually got saved, but he said that one of the things that he heard from the group that he was with back in the day, back in San Francisco in the late 60s, was that occultists believe that we Christians are practicing a similar form of magic to their own, but that we're so stupid we don't realize it, and so our magic is very weak. That's how they view us, he said. Let me ask you this. Through your research, how effective is their magic? Can they really summon things and make things happen as Christians? Should we worry about that or be concerned about what these so-called practitioners of magic are capable of doing?
Well, you have to remember that so much of what happens between, especially the primal witch that I've written about, and let's say a demon who's giving the direct tutelage, you have to remember that so much of that is contractual. And we have stuff like, the Lesser Key of Solomon, one of the most famous grimoires that talks about, Jewish tradition saying that Solomon could control demons.
Right.
Yeah. And the summoning part, yes. The control, if it's ever there, is illusory. That's to use these practitioners as pawns to whatever ends these entities happen to have at the time, or of course fitting into the larger scheme of the demonic plan overall. So the control element is illusory, but the contact is very, the summoning is very, very real. And those entities, of course, can work through practitioners. But, it's interesting that they put it that way, that Christians, once they've submitted to Christ and are in a relation, that they have this, they have a power that trumps. Even Jesus said that you will do these things in greater. Well, he wasn't just saying that as hyperbole. He was saying that, not only will you do this stuff, but you need to be able to do this stuff, and you are going to do this stuff. You're going to have to do this stuff. because it was so much of a part of his own ministry, for even his disciples, and by proxy for us too, and it should be. And as a footnote to all that, I would say that I hear from, friends and contacts that I still have in a community that even neo-pagans these days, I'm hearing more and more about accounts from them saying that it's getting harder and harder to control these entities. In other words, that's more and more evidence to the point that I was making before, that the control that they appear to have is illusory.
That's really interesting because Dr. Greg Reed, who I know is a friend of yours, he's spoken at your Sons of God, Giants of Old conferences in the past, who comes out of a satanic ritual abuse scenario, and he works with law enforcement around the country, consulting on occult crimes, and also works with SRA victims, said that people that he hears from who are kind of embedded with occult groups and report back to him as to what they're hearing. He told me this almost 2 years ago now, that he was hearing from them that these occult practitioners are saying there is something coming through the veil now. And again, bear in mind, this is old information, but 2 years ago, something was coming through and they don't know how to stop it. They don't know how to close the doorway. Mm. So now Mike Heiser, also a speaker at your excellent conference, made this observation once. In fact, I remembered it today, and I threw it into the manuscript I'm working on for my forthcoming book, that practitioners of magic are often, as you say, their control over these entities is illusory. They don't really control these things. These things are allowing the practitioners, the magicians, to think, or the witches to think that they're being controlled. Mm-hmm. But it's for their own purposes. They're playing a much higher level game than the witches, warlocks, and magicians are playing. Heiser was commenting on the Babylon Working, which is the sex rite magic that was done in early 1946 by L. Ron Hubbard, founder of and Jack Parsons, founder of JPL. And Mike said, look, if these entities are so weak, they need the permission of a couple of deviants performing sex rites in the desert to get the power to come through, or to have permission of these guys to come through, then they're really lame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they're more powerful than that, but I think my take on this, and I just want your opinion on this as well. My take on this is that these magicians really aren't all that powerful. I don't worry about them. I think that they're to be pitied, because ultimately, once they're no longer useful to these entities, they'll be thrown under the bus. I think the concern is that they are deceiving others around them into switching allegiances, if they've ever had an allegiance to Jesus Christ, but they're being convinced that these entities are the team that they should be on, rather than we in the church doing an effective job of evangelizing and saying, look, as far as power in the spirit realm, we got nothing. Mm-hmm. But Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, they're real. And they are far more powerful than anything that you can summon from the dark side. Is that an effective characterization, an accurate characterization of this struggle?
Yes, I believe so. And it's not even, it may not even be a deception into necessarily a religious tradition like Wicca or neo-paganism or Luciferianism. It may just be a persuasion into, everything that postmodernism stands for. Mm-hmm. Antinomianism and hedonism and glorification of the self.
Transhumanism.
That's enough, right? Yeah.
They really don't care what we believe, as long as it's not the one thing that's true.
That's right.
So as Walpurgisnacht winds down, as we're recording this here in the United States, on the evening of May 1st, it's already ended, presumably. Maybe the late parties are still continuing over there on the other side of the pond. We pray that the Spirit will energize us who know the truth to just recognize that we're nothing special. We're just the beggars who know where to get the free meal, and to find the words to speak when opportunity presents. Our friend Carl Teichrob, I mentioned earlier, has been saying that these pagan gods are talking to their followers. He was at the Paganicon in Minneapolis year before last and said that he was hearing from people there who are followers of everything from Athena to Thor, that they're being told the time has come to rebuild their temples. So maybe what we are seeing is a sense from those who are dabbling with spirits in the dark side of the supernatural, that time is growing short. These spirits sense that their time is growing short, and they're trying to initiate their end game now.
It would certainly seem so. I mean, again, just, trying to keep my ear to the rail, so to speak. That's kind of the impression that I get. And, as you're talking, as we've been talking about, what kind of, can we have a conversation with these folks? That there's certainly, that's part of the kingdom work, as Mike Heiser's fond of saying, the Great Commission doesn't say go forth into all the world and hunt Nephilim. We're to make disciples. So, there has to be that conversation, and I'm not trying to be flippant here. I'm just reminded of that line from the song "The Gambler" by Kenny Rogers. That particularly because of the timing and everything that seems to be ramping up. There's that line, where he says, "Son, I made a life out of reading people's faces, knowing how the cards were by the way they held their eyes." Mm-hmm. So if you don't mind me saying, I can see you're out of aces. So maybe instead of for a taste of your whiskey, I'll give you some advice, maybe a cup of coffee or something like that. Mm-hmm. But, that same kind of, and again, I'm not trying to be flippant. It's a good illustration, because time is running out for these folks, and our kingdom work, has to happen, until, the fullness of the Gentiles, essentially, as the scriptures outline, whenever God, decides that whenever the fullness of the Gentiles, is discipled, we can certainly see the clock turning. We just don't know, exactly what day that's going to be. Mm-hmm. But, so we still have to be at the work, that we're at. And we can certainly, I think once people realize, that by becoming a Christian, so much of your worldview has to be geared toward the supernatural war that's been going on, since time immemorial. That we have to have these conversations with people outside of our comfort zone. Mm-hmm. And I think it could be it has been in the past an enjoyable experience for me, because you're talking about well, for us, we're already geared towards talking about all of this fringy high strangeness, and so you're in your zone. But that's the thing about reading the Bible, and getting to know it again like this, through a supernatural worldview, it's like reading it all over again, and you've got this new, this new toolkit, this new capacity to enter into these kinds of conversations with people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And knowledge is power. It begins with knowing what is in the Word and how to transmit that information to others. That is part of your work at the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. What is going on there, and how do people find out more about what they can learn through the Institute? Well,
on that note, that's why I've developed these certification programs, through the Institute. I've got 3 right now, and I'm developing some other ones. But the Biblical Anthropology was the first one, and there's a witchcraft, a class on the history and culture of witchcraft through the biblical lens that people can take within that. But I developed 2 other ones to focus in more on these sorts of topics. One is biblical demonology, where people can, really take a deeper dive, into examining that world, and then the preternatural morphology talks about the demonic manifestations and things like vampirism and ghouls and werewolves, and there's even a component on witchcraft as well, and that's really that was really part of the call that I had, was to develop these programs so that people could dive into this stuff quick, but also get a thorough, immersion in the literature, so that you're not just talking woo-woo.
Right.
You actually got, source material that you can use in addition to the Bible to be able to enter into these kinds of conversations with people. I had a buddy of mine say, "Well, you're kind of doing what Bruce Lee did with martial arts, right?" I was like, what do you mean? He's like, his was he took bits and pieces of different martial arts systems and made this fluid system called Jeet Kune Do, which means the way of the intercepting fist. And he was like, this is kind of the way of the intercepting faith. I said, well, I don't know if I can use that, but I guess you're right.
That is brilliant.
So yeah, I'm actually running a special this week that people can take it. I may extend it, actually. People can take advantage of. Each one of the certifications is on sale for I think either $125 or $150. So that, again, you would be paying more than that much per hour for a 3-hour college course.
Mm-hmm.
And I what I'm doing is I'm condensing and giving you still maintaining the academic rigor, of this topical material, and giving it to people, at these prices. So, and I keep getting more students, and there's room for more. So if you're interested, you feel compelled, then I would encourage people to prayerfully consider.
And that's at tioba.org. I'm looking at your Twitter feed right now. $150, 12 course certifications, including biblical anthropology, biblical demonology, or preternatural morphology. And then rudiments of New Testament Greek for $225. You'll find it all there at the website for the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, tioba.org. That'll be linked in the show notes.
And people can just email me at professorburton@yahoo.com if they want to register.
Sounds good. The website for everything else that Judd does is burtonbeyond.com. And Judd, look forward to seeing you out here in the Ozarks soon.
Yes, indeed. I look forward. That's pretty country out there.
Amen. Dr. Judd Burton online at burtonbeyond.com and the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, tioba.org. Again, both of those links in the show notes. So, if these practitioners of magic, if these occultists are not very powerful, why do we bring them up at all? Why don't we just focus on Jesus? That and a couple of conference notes straight ahead on A View from the Bunker. Question: how do you fight something you cannot see? Davian is a third-level master of the Order, a small group of men who alone have the power to battle the most fearsome creatures in all of Saramond. For thousands of years, the Brothers of the Order have protected their world. Now, something has upset the delicate balance of power between man and dragon, and Davian must face what appears to be a dragon that cannot be seen. But Davian is losing his grip on reality, and the fate of the world rests with a stable hand, an underfed priest, and a gardener who's fallen from the stars. Iron Dragons, Book 1 of the Saramond Quest, by Derek P. Gilbert. New from Rose Avenue Fiction. Talking the Walk Sunday nights from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker, online, VFTB.net. You'll find us elsewhere, such as Spreaker.com, which hosts all of the audio going back to the very first program back in 2009. You'll also find us at Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Amazon Music even, and elsewhere, wherever fine podcasts are sold. You'll find us on social media, Twitter at View from Bunker or at Derek Gilbert. That's where I do most of my tweeting. Facebook, View from the Bunker. Also on Gab and MeWe, Derek P. Gilbert. So a question we often get is, why do we deal with these esoteric topics? Why do we worry about what witches and warlocks and sorcerers are doing if we truly believe that they on their own don't have much in the way of power? which I believe is the case. Why do we deal with giants? Why did Sharon and I write 2 books now, essentially focusing on the cult of the dead and the existence of giants and dragons in the Bible? Do we just like chasing weird stuff? Well, yeah, we kind of do, but not to the point where we're trying to take away from our primary mission, which is to share the hope that we have in Christ Jesus and make disciples of all nations. And the fact is that these alternate belief systems, these neo-pagan beliefs, are drawing a lot of people away from the gospel because we in the church are not prepared to answer questions that people have about things like those weird lights in the sky, unidentified aerial phenomena. I guess that's the new term that all the cool kids use, UAPs, UFOs, that's so 20th century. Why do we deal with that stuff? Why don't we just talk about Jesus? Well, we do. The historical reasons for the faith that we have in Jesus Christ. What Sharon and I are doing through our research, what Judd Burton is doing, Mike Heiser is doing, Doug Hamp, L.A. Marzulli, Steve Quayle, Tom Horn, Tim Alberino. Newer additions this, Ryan Pitterson, Tyler Gilreath, who will be a guest on the show here in the next few weeks, Josh Peck, and others. What we're trying to do is show people who are fascinated by these weird things, because there are many of them out there. Frankly, when you read the surveys and really break down the numbers, you see that there are more people who believe that America has been visited by unidentified flying objects, visitors from other planets, than believe that God is who he said he is in his word. I mean, really, break down the numbers. Look at the research done by the Barna Group, he's now at Arizona Christian University, but his research shows that, 7% of American adults, something like that, have a biblical worldview. So 7% of American adults believe in God as he has revealed himself through his word, and yet something like a third of us believe that there's good evidence that we've been visited by extraterrestrials. There are more who believe in the woo-woo of UAPs than believe in the God of the Bible. And as Christians, that should embarrass us. That should alarm us. That should make us weep. Because we have history and we have truth on our side. We have evidence. We have eyewitness testimony. And yes, archaeology, the rocks literally do cry out that Jesus Christ is Lord. And yet most of us, according to survey after survey, whether it's Barna or Pew Research or Gallup or Harris, shows that most of us Christians in America, most of us Christians on planet Earth, don't really believe that most of the characters in Scripture are real. Tell you what, God calls them gods. Was he just being allegorical, metaphorical? Symbolic? Or was he really addressing evil intelligences in the spirit realm who want to destroy you, your family, and everything that you love? I argue that it's the latter, because that's what Jesus taught the apostles. That's what Paul meant when he wrote that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. That's why I've been saying it after every program for the last, 400 and some odd shows, going back to 2009. That's why we do what we do. People find these curious things, these oddities, fascinating. That's why we're into season 13 of Ancient Aliens? Even though it's based on a lie. I'm sorry, as Mike Heiser has pointed out, either Zechariah Sitchin couldn't read Sumerian, or he could, and he was just making stuff up. And it's turned into a cottage industry. People travel from all over the world to Roswell or McMinnville, Oregon, or Eureka Springs, Arkansas, or Joshua Tree, California, to attend conferences where they believe they'll get the answers to the big questions of life that we have answers to in the book that holds what we say is the Word of God. And yet most of us Christians don't take it seriously. Oh, that's weird stuff. We'll just talk about Jesus. Well, there is a place for that. Yes, absolutely. Talk about the love of Jesus Christ. But if people don't accept the premise that they are sinners in need of salvation, then Jesus just becomes this guy who gave us a list of rules that make life boring. But if you teach the kids young that, hey, we're living in a world that is surrounded by these supernatural entities that are more fantastic than wheels within wheels, covered with eyes, and they're They're alive? Dragons. Yeah. Literal dragons. With 7 heads, which is even more terrifying than Smug or even King Ghidorah. But guess what? We have a superpower. It's called the Holy Spirit. Maybe we should be teaching that to our kids. And these people, and then they wouldn't, as they got older, start looking to spiritual pursuits like witches or seances or neo-paganism or what have you. And they would recognize these lies for what they are when they're presented. And we would start taking people seriously, like Patrisse Cullors, Dr. Melina Abdullah of Black Lives Matter, when they say that their work is actually spiritual and they're literally summoning the spirits of the dead to help them do their work. Hey, as Christians, that should send up a red flag, and yet they're doing it and pouring out drink offerings, libations, inside churches. Because we have become spiritually blind and deaf and dumb. That's why we do what we do. We need to educate ourselves and then pray for the courage and the words to speak when the opportunities present, like Paul on Mars Hill. I see you Athenians are very religious. Let me tell you about this unknown God over here. A couple of conference notes. The Future Vision 2021 conference from our friends at Prophecy Watchers, due to what appear to be travel restrictions that will not be lifted in time in the state of Colorado, has been canceled. So they are working on a virtual conference, and details on that are forthcoming. The Warriors Conference from Hear the Watchman coming up in San Diego in September. That is still on. The Legacy Resort Hotel and Spa. Sharon and I plan to be there with Pastor Paul Begley, Jamie Walden, Colonel David Giamona, David Heavener, Joni Stahl, John and Chelsea Jubilee, and more. September 16th through 18th, the dates of 2021, that is, if you're hearing this in the archives at some point down the road. You can find out more and register online, hearthewatchmen.com, hearthewatchmen.com. September is going to be a busy month for us. We're planning to go to an archaeology conference the weekend before that. We're also, by the way, I should tell you, don't have details on this yet, but the first weekend in August, let me get the dates on this real quick. New friends here in the local Springfield, Missouri area, Branson, Missouri area, at His Call Ministries. Alec and Ginny Wade, they have invited us back. And this will be August 6th, 7th, and 8th. August 6th through 8th. This will be in Sparta, Missouri, at Finley River Ranch. HisCallMinistries.net is the website. Don't think they've got any information on that yet, but just giving you a heads up if you want to block out those dates, August 6th, 7th, and 8th of 2021. Our Skywatch TV tour of Israel, October 3rd through 18th, that is still on as far as we're concerned. Now, I know that this past week, as I'm recording this May 1st, the Israeli Tourism Ministry announced that they will be opening up the country to foreign tourists if they've been vaccinated during the month of May. Now, Sharon and I, let me be clear, Sharon and I have no interest in taking a vaccine. It's still experimental. And we are not anti-vaxxers, and we don't think the vaccine is the mark of the beast. We don't think the Moderna vaccine or the RNA vaccine will not change your DNA, but we don't know enough about the vaccine's long-term effects. These are still experimental. They've been released for use under an emergency use authorization. So we're not really willing to volunteer to be test subjects, essentially. And I know that many people have either been compelled to, they felt it was in their best interest to. My mother's been vaccinated. I've got other family members who've been vaccinated. It's their choice. In my mother's case, she's in an age where the virus is probably a greater risk to her than long-term side effects. But anyway, this is the thing. Israel understands they need American tourists. They need Christian tourists because we Western Christians make up the majority of their annual tourists. And they also know that evangelical Christians, especially American evangelicals, are probably the least likely to want to take the vaccine. Something like 45% of us say, nah, we're not interested. So they're going to have to make a decision as to whether they want to just shut us off because I know that a lot of people who have expressed interest in the tour are not interested in getting vaccinated, and to be honest, neither are Sharon and I. So we'll see what happens. A lot of time yet between now and October, but we're talking with this with Lipkin Tours about this. They're aware of the situation. They understand the situation, so we'll see what they have to say. We're blocking out alternate dates in 2022 just in case. So we will keep you posted. Just keep an eye on skywatchtv.com and Sharon and I at unravelingrevelation.tv. And we'll keep you posted as soon as we learn more about what is happening with the travel situation between here and Israel. So next week, we're going to talk to Dr. Doug Hamp. We're going to talk with him again about his book, Corrupting the Image 2, and dig deeper into the research that he's done. Again, groundbreaking research. Doug has actually come up with something that scholars have been studying Enochic literature and the archaeology of Mount Hermon for 100 years have missed. I'm not exaggerating. So we'll continue that conversation. We talked with him once before, but just a few weeks back, and we'll do that again this coming week. That will be for next Sunday night, May the 9th, on View from the Bunker, which is a production of Gilbert House, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Our announcer, DC Good. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.